This is Trend Following Radio, where great thinking comes alive. Nobel Prize winners, legendary traders, best-selling authors, and the pros that know what drive us irrational human beings. I am your host, MICHAEL COVEL. Not filtered, raw, honest. That's my passion. At age 19, my guest today became the youngest woman to ever climb Denali, the highest mountain in North America. She climbed Mount Rainier, Mount Kilimanjaro. She went on to become one of the Army's first female attack helicopter pilots, eventually leading an Apache flight platoon on deployment in Bosnia. Now, you already know with that mild, basic setup that she's interesting. There's going to be something in this woman that you want to learn about because maybe you can use it for yourself. But it was during those climbs, during those flights, during that training that she learned about grit. Yeah, grit, G-R-I-T. That something that you know you got to have to win, to get over the hump. My guest today is Shannon Polson. And today we talk about that very issue, grit, in her new book, The Grit Factor. Ladies and gentlemen, without any further delay, let's jump right into my guest, Shannon Polson, and find out what it takes to get to the highest peaks, to learn how to fly an Apache helicopter. You just know there's a lesson there that you can apply to your own life. I hope you enjoy this conversation. A native of Alaska, I've never been. I've been a few places in my life, but I've never been to Alaska. I want to go. Does native mean born there and spent your formative years there? What does that mean?
Yeah, that's right. My dad was drafted out of law school for Vietnam and sent to Alaska instead as an Army JAG officer, which is an Army lawyer, and decided to stay. So I was born up there about a year before he got out of the Army.
This might seem unusual for the start of a conversation or an interview. I hope not. I really want to stay at Alaska for a moment because I want to know, you're a woman. I mean, I could ask the same question to a guy if I was talking to him right now, but I want to know when you're 8, 9, 10 years old in Alaska, how much different is that than America? What are the differences? What's the vibe? What is going on? Or is it just the same?
Most Alaskans would say that where I grew up, which is Anchorage, and actually just outside of Anchorage, but is Little Seattle because it's really half of the state's population is there. It's a town that's around 250 to 300,000 people. We were outside the city, but still we were in Anchorage. The rest of Alaska would laugh at this, but I will say that now that I've lived in many, many other places as well, that I think it was a pretty awesome place to grow up. For many, many reasons. One is all of the access to the outdoors and the experience in the outdoors. But one of them is there is an element of toughness that's required. When you drive in the winter, you have candles and warm clothing in the back in case you go off the road because you may or may not have somebody pick you up. The joke that I always like to tell is true, is that we have bumper stickers up there that say Alaska, where men are men and women win the Iditarod, which of course is a reference to the 1,000-mile dog sled race that has been won by women. I think there was definitely a sense that women need to do the same things and be able to be skillful and capable as men, and they do them. So there was really no question in my mind that anything was the possibility.
Do you find that universal? Is an interesting comment about women. I've spent the last 7 or 8 years in Asia, a lot of time in Vietnam, and I do find, for example, and I want you to kind of contrast to Alaska and see if there's a similarity, but I find that the women in Vietnam are extremely tough-minded. Now, it doesn't take much thinking to think perhaps why millions of men were killed during the war and folks had to run the show. And you will find now in society in Vietnam, there doesn't seem to be this male-dominated corporate world. In Vietnam, if you walk into a boardroom, the boss could very well be the billionaire woman. In fact, the first billionaire in Vietnam was a woman, first entrepreneurial billionaire, started airline. It's really interesting that I'm in the middle of this culture where I've gotten a lot more used to. I enjoy it, frankly. So I'm curious, is Alaska similar where all women do have this vibe that you're speaking of?
I think so much of this is individual as much as it is cultural. So I don't think that it is all women. Although at the same time, when you're immersed in that kind of an environment to some degree, I think you must have some element of it. Yeah, I feel like it's really hard to make a generalization across an entire population always. And I generally reject those sorts of generalizations, although there are some that can be made. Now, tell me, I don't know, this is going to show my ignorance of history, but from my experience, I was in Korea and traveled through Japan a couple of times and spent some time in China, very little relative to you living in Vietnam. But my impression was that those countries that had gone through the whole communist revolution, which had many awful things about it, but that there was more gender equality in those because of the political requirements, really, of this communist revolution than there were in the places that didn't have that. For example, Korea and Japan, I think, don't have that same kind of equality that you're discussing.
Yeah, it's a great question. I don't know for sure. And I find all of the countries, and I guess this gets back to getting away from generalizations. I find all of the countries in Asia are quite different in many ways. Really depends on what's been happening over their course of history. Even the word communist, this is an interesting word for Americans to discuss because I can't detect anything in Vietnam amongst the gleaming skyscrapers and the constant merchant selling and the entrepreneurial zeal. I can't detect anything that reminds the American story of what the USSR was, which was a backwards kind of place. The labels really do get at our biases, huh?
They definitely do. And that, again, that's such a broad question that it's not a good one at all. I remember the discussion in China specifically that there was a lot more gender equality because of some pretty horrible things that happened, but that was one of the things that might have been better amongst those horrible things.
I do think, though, for Japan, for example, I do know, and I've talked to a lot of Caucasian guys who will go to Japan and they'll get in conversations, and I've been to Japan a bunch, but the women will express they don't like kind of the positioning in society. And there is that internal kind of conflict going on because of perhaps what you're talking about, the male-dominated culture.
Yes, that's definitely fair. And it is interesting how different countries that are not so far apart have just very different histories and different ways that that's played out in their cultures.
And I don't know if we're talking about it yet exactly. Let's get at the word before we even get into like all the content and all the research and stuff that you've done. But let's talk about this word grit, because I think that's a little bit of what we're talking about right now, is perhaps we're talking about women, individual women, which may extend to a cultural grouping too, but women and men, of course. But today our conversation is about you. Grit. It's such a great word, a word that even though I know there's a professor out of Pennsylvania spoken a lot about it, this word is not, if you flip on the news or you listen to politicians, they don't walk out there and tell the people, listen, you know what? The most important thing, or one of the most important things that we can possibly talk about to get you moving forward is grit. When's the last time someone walked out on CNN or Fox and said that?
Well, I don't know, but I was excited to see that it was mentioned twice by the presumptive nominee First Lady, Jill Biden, as well as Michelle Obama at one of the conventions. That was pretty exciting that they mentioned it. Each of them mentioned it in their speech. And I thought, gosh, I didn't pay them for that, but that's so great. But no, you're right. You don't hear it in the news often in that same sort of a sense. You're right.
Well, on the flip side too, and not to be partisan at all, but if any politician is really kind of talking about grit or telling us about it, ultimately, maybe we've already messed up in some ways, because it really does have to be something. Look, you are not who you are, unless you're going to correct me and tell me I'm completely crazy. You're not who you are because some politician gave you permission. Regardless of the partisan stripe, you're who you are because of you.
That's right. It's interesting because grit is this thing that, and again, for professors and academics, I think it's often considered in this very isolated context, as it has to be if you're a scientist and an academic. My experience, and through all of the dozens of other leaders that I interviewed for this book, and I think that's pretty important because it's not just my own experience, it's not just my own story, it's these dozens of other women leaders in the vanguard of their military field. So there's early women general officers, a submariner, a combat rescue swimmer, an early woman Army Ranger, the first woman Thunderbird pilot. So it's this incredible group of leaders. What became pretty clear for me is that it's not just about grit in the moment, because grit in the moment is a necessary component of success for sure. Obviously, Angela Duckworth defines it as passion and perseverance towards a long-term goal. I've defined it as a dogged determination in the face of difficult circumstance. But at the same time, this element that we define is part of a broader and more holistic system that is really part of this whole leader concept that I think is really important to understand.
Okay, let me take it back in time because I kind of started to go too far away from where I really wanted to start, which is again, you. Let me take you back to Alaska. There's a mountain that we've all heard there or heard about there. I don't know anything about it at all. I've got a buddy who, her and her husband were doing Kilimanjaro last year, but I have a sneaky suspicion that's a little bit different than Mount McKinley. And you were going up Mount McKinley as a very young woman. Put this all in context, okay? So for us outsiders, if I hear that you at age 19 would be the youngest?
At the time. I believe I've since been surpassed probably many times, but this was 1991, so.
Put that in context, though. What does that mean exactly? Why would that have been the woman part of it and the age part of it? Why would that have been unique at the time for that particular mountain?
Mountaineering still, I mean, there are some phenomenal women that are climbing and have been climbing for a long time, but it has always been a very male-dominated activity. There's no question. And I remember one of the guides, not one that we climbed with, but one that I had gone out and done some ice climbing with, was making some comments about women and their abilities, which I think other climbers who knew women guides and women climbers were pretty frustrated with. There was definitely that vibe where it felt like it was okay to a lot of the guys to say these things that were pretty disrespectful and condescending. I was just back from college one summer. I went with my mom actually to a Rotary meeting, and they discussed this climb that was set up to be the 50th anniversary of the Anchorage, Alaska Rotary Club climb. I had looked at it on the horizon, obviously, all growing up. You can see it. It's 20,000 feet high, but from base to summit is that, I believe, the highest mountain in the world that's not a volcano underwater. So it starts at 2,000 feet. It goes to 20,000 feet. Base camp is around 7,000 feet. In contrast, Everest is, of course, higher, but you start at 17,000 feet. So base to summit is a pretty big climb. It's all glacial. It's all ice and snow. You can see it from many, many places in Alaska. So I'd grown up looking at it on the horizon and thought maybe one day I'll climb that thing. But, like a kid, one day I'll be an astronaut. One day I'll go to the moon. Then this opportunity opened up. There were guides and there was a team of amateur climbers that was going to make the attempt. So I signed up.
And what kind of training went involved here? I mean, how much time did you have to train, or were you just kind of jumping and going?
Typically, you would train quite a bit. I was young, obviously. I had started out in Army ROTC already in college. I had been training for a school called Air Assault School, which you do these long ruck marches with heavy packs. So I had been running 12 miles with a heavy backpack on my back that spring, getting ready for this Army school. And so I'd been doing a lot of training already. I only had about a month before the climb once I signed up, which typically would be absurd. Probably was absurd, actually. But because I'd been doing that training, it seemed like it was within the realm of possibility. When you're 19, you don't know what you're signing up for. But somehow my parents thought that was all right and let me go. Yeah.
I've never done anything like that. You get to the top. And what's so funny is here, I'm looking at your book, and I know there's a certain vibe to your book and a certain perspective, obviously, that's saying, hey, and I'm paraphrasing here, hey, women can do basically anything men can do. That's a lot of what the message is here. What's interesting, though, is here I am as a man, and I'm listening to your story, and I'm thinking, well, I don't know if I'm going to ever pull that one off. I'm 52. I'm in pretty good shape, but I don't know if I'm ever going to pull that one off. I'm trying to think, what's the difference between man and woman when it comes to this conversation? Because you've had a chance to do something that only a limited number of people in the history of the planet have probably done. In that sense, man or woman, I'm not really sure it's relevant to my next question, which is really, what the heck does it feel like when you get to the top?
Oh my gosh. The thing is, our climb was very complicated, and it was complicated by really bad weather, which often is the reason that 50% of the people have to turn around. We had, of our amateur climbing team that started out with 6, only 2 of us, which was a guide and me, made it to the top. We were stuck at high camp at 17,000 feet, which is in the death zone where your body doesn't really process things anymore, for about a week because of really bad weather. We ran out of food. I mean, it was a pretty crazy experience. We did 2 summit attempts. The first one, we almost made it to the summit. And if you can imagine climbing from 17 to 20,000 feet, it's not your easiest day. certainly one of the more challenging things I've done in my life, maybe the most. And we had to turn around just shy of the summit because a storm was coming in. So then we did another attempt, made it that time, but we literally had like a minute at the summit. And you've put so much effort, I mean, physical and mental focus into this incredibly long, difficult day that I want to say there's elation, but I think there was just sort of this awareness that, okay, we're here, let's take a picture. We got to get down before the storm comes in again so that we can be safe. Most accidents happen on the descent and climbing. So the fact that you got up there, you can't relax at all. You can't really enjoy it until you get off the mountain. And then you think back and say, wow, that was something.
I caught a documentary recently. I'm not sure if you're familiar with him. I guess you are. Alex Honnold.
Honnold. I don't know that I am, actually.
The guy that does the free climbing with the no
Oh,
ropes. Yes.
yes.
Okay.
Yeah. Is this free solo?
Yes. Right.
Okay. I've not seen it yet.
You know who he is and you know what he does.
Yes.
So here you are. You've got a lot more experience on climbing than the average person. And then you look at this guy climbing sheer granite with like nooks and crannies straight up and no ropes. I mean, is that grit or is that something else?
I actually saw this really interesting interview. Well, it was a discussion about things like grit and resilience. And his comment, which I thought was interesting, and it's the only way that you can make any sense out of something like that, because otherwise it just seems absolutely insane to me anyway, is that he is so incredibly competent and he's prepared, not just physically. I mean, physically is just sort of his baseline. It's the mental preparation and memorizing every single move. And so for him, it's sort of like doing a math problem, as I believe how he described it. I could be misquoting him a bit here, but he really thought of it as, hey, look, this is a year of mental preparation and memorization. The physical piece, I already got it down. It's not a 3-week sort of a thing where the weather's going to come in on you, but it still doesn't make any sense to me. But that makes slightly more sense to me. And he would, I think, say that it's not at all about grit. It's about being prepared and having planned just to the utmost, which is totally fascinating and still not relatable for most of us.
As a side tangent, I interviewed a Nobel Prize winner once, a guy named Vernon Smith. I knew he was quite famous, economist, quite famous for having Asperger's. I go to interview him and I'm in this busy college office. It's all packed with stuff. We're setting up lights and everything. And I say, hey, Dr. Smith, we're probably gonna make a lot of noise. Are we gonna bother you? And he just looked at me and he goes, I won't know you're here. and, and I thought, because when I listen to Alex Honnold talk, he does seem like a young man who might be on the spectrum as well. And I wonder sometimes that people have these kind of unique situations that happen in their mind where they do have this kind of superpower of focus. I'm not saying he is. If I had to place a guess, I would say, and I know this is also pretty common across coders, for example, in Silicon Valley.
Sure. Yeah, that's fair. I have no idea about the spectrum thing, but there is a unique ability one way or the other to be able to stay completely focused and in that zone. I feel like some of the things that I've done they're fun and interesting and adventurous and sometimes dangerous and sometimes scary, but they're not that. What you're describing is a whole different sphere of operation for sure.
Yours is at the upper level and these guys are just, maybe a guy like Alex Honnold goes to another level, but your level is really high up for us average mere mortals. Because, for example, I want you to take me through the story. First off, before I get to helicopters, attack helicopters, getting into the Army, going into the Army, what was the decision making there?
I have a huge bias towards action, maybe to a fault. My husband and I always laugh because he's always on the 5 to 7 year plan. And I'm like, hey, let's do it tomorrow. We even out pretty well together. But I think I've always had some of that. And I could get into all kinds of reasons. I think that partly is the case, first child and parents got divorced and that kind of thing. I mean, I enjoy it as well. I enjoy the adventure and I enjoy pushing myself and taking risks. And I think part of that is growing up in Alaska. And again, part of it is probably trying to prove myself in some way as an eldest child. I'm not sure. I'm sure there's more psychology that goes into it than that. But when I was heading to Duke University from Alaska, and Duke, I mean, it could not have been more different than Anchorage, Alaska. It was still, I consider it the biggest culture shock of my life to go to this Southern university with this entrenched Greek system. And we didn't talk about fit back then. We just thought, hey, I was going to a good school and it's great. And I was getting a long way from home, which was also the goal. And then I knew that college was a huge financial stretch and I had loans and I had some savings.
Duke is more than a stretch.
Right. It was a big stretch. I was there and been applying to colleges. My dad asked me just very briefly, he wasn't pushing anything, but he said, "Hey, would you consider the academies or ROTC?" And I just laughed at him. I just said, I'm not going to be military. That's not my thing. And he never brought it up again. But then I was there and I was working in a restaurant as a waitress. I was working at the East Campus Housing Office. I went and just checked out the ROTC tables at some college fair, and both Navy and Air Force wanted you to be an engineer, but I knew that I wanted to study in the humanities. And the Army said you could study whatever you wanted. They didn't care. So I figured, hey, I'll sign up and just give it a shot. And it was sort of a lark in a way. I figured I would say, I tried it, but I didn't like it. It wasn't for me. I ended up really, really enjoying it. I think the combination of connecting to something that was bigger than myself, which is very much a way that I was brought up, connecting to this idea of service, as well as a cohort of companions and classmates who were people like me, who had worked ever since they were able to earn 25 cents an hour and had been saving for college. And that was not the norm at Duke. I think that was a cohort that I really related to and enjoyed.
Let me keep you at something before I get to attack helicopters. You just said the entrenched Greek system. If I was sitting around just maybe having tea or a beer with you or something, if I heard you say entrenched Greek system, I would immediately say, oh, wow, you've got the same view of fraternities and sororities that I do. Now, I could be completely wrong in going out on a limb there. When you say entrenched Greek system, that doesn't sound approving.
I know there are people who get a lot out of their affiliations there.
So politically correct.
I am not personally a fan.
Oh, so, boy, this is the diplomacy. The diplomacy this is State Department level diplomacy.
I am not actually known for my diplomacy. So, and again, there are wonderful people who are part of these associations. I think that's great. I generally don't have a very favorable opinion of them. No.
Yeah. That's not the point of our conversation. You just mentioned it, and I thought to myself, I was like, well, I've got something more in common with Shannon. So
Well, the interesting thing is my husband went to Middlebury in part because they didn't have a Greek system. I didn't even know what the Greek system was until I showed up at Duke. And then I thought, gosh, I'm supposed to get into this. And I sort of made some little paltry little effort. And then I was just so turned off. It turns out that my dad had been the president of his fraternity at University of Kansas when he was there. And then he de-pledged, which I think is a really big deal to basically say, and unfortunately he's not around to be able to ask about that whole process or reason or decision. And then my mom, I think, was asked to join some sororities and then declined to rush. And so it turns out it might be genetic. We all are not inclined that way.
I showed up at a small liberal arts college in Virginia, Southern Virginia. My first year, I left after 1 year. And I think I left primarily because showing up there at age 17 and seeing the Greek system, I was just like, wow, this is not what I expected. I don't want to be around this mindset. I just don't want to be around this mindset. I knew immediately. It was like a snap of a fingers. I saw people begging to be friends with each other and doing vile things to themselves, to their own humanity, vile things to be friends with other vile people. And I said, at 17, you can't really describe what you're feeling and seeing as much as you can 30, 40 years later, but I just knew I wanted no part of it.
The interesting thing is, though, and it's funny, I had no expectations of having this part of the conversation, but I do think that there is an element that relates to the military, and it relates to a lot of different things, actually, but there's this desire to connect and desire to be part of something. I think the question is, what are the rules of that and the requirements of that connection that you're making, and are they acceptable? And I think I see that with adults. I saw that in the military for sure, and some of it was good and some of it was terrible. So I do think that's maybe what that really is all about, is this desire for belonging, this desire for connection, this desire for meaning something, and trying to find it in a way that I think is unfortunately misplaced. But again, I'm sure there are others that would disagree.
If you show up on a college campus and you're captive and you're a young person, and what do you do with this system? You can revolt, leave, whatever, or join. So I think it's kind of like a bad system. Whereas, okay, if we flip it to the Army, I'm sure there's pros and cons to the Army, but at least there seems to be an ethos and an understanding and a philosophy that we're getting to somewhere that has some good to it. Now, I'm sure, again, I don't want to stay at sororities and fraternities. People could say there's some good to it too, but it's not the kind of good that you would find in the military.
Right. I imagine they both have some ideals that are laudable, and there is an execution that sometimes not only falls short, but is perhaps reprehensible in both cases. So, yes.
So listen, across every movie that everyone has seen in the last 30 or 40 years, you ultimately see in some kind of an action film some representation of an attack helicopter that probably is based on what you once flew.
Sure.
Take me, the mere mortal. What is the process? Where in the hell does it start? We could talk about this for days and weeks. I know. So that's up to you to use your skill to reduce this to a way that all of us people can kind of get. But like, where does it start? Like, I mean, how much time, what kind of cookbook do they give you that you have to study? I mean, where's the beginning of ultimately becoming a pilot for an Apache attack helicopter?
Well, you have to start by having some entry point into the military and somehow making your way to Fort Rucker, Alabama, which they call Mother Rucker. I'll just make sure my enunciation is really good on, on that one, because that's the heart of Army aviation and has been for some time. So I headed there after college, not immediately after college, about 6 months later. And that's where we had the aviation officer basic course and initial entry rotary wing course. So the initial part of flight school. When I first graduated from college, actually right about when I was getting ready to graduate, Apaches weren't open for women to fly. Attack aircraft and scout aircraft were not available for women pilots at all. Congress lifted the combat exclusion clause in spring of 1993. And so when I reported to Fort Rucker, it was then open. I graduated a year later as an honor grad of the aviation officer basic course in flight school. And at that point decided that I had requested and I was assigned the Apache. In the course of that, we trained on Hueys, the UH-1 Huey, that is the old Vietnam helicopter. I don't think they continued to use them for training relatively shortly after I graduated.
Did you have any flight experience
No.
prior?
And they kind of prefer that you don't, I think, because they really want you to learn the way that they want you to learn to fly.
Is a lot of classroom before you even get close to a helicopter first? What's the process?
About a month or 6 weeks of the aviation officer basic course on either end of the actual flight school experience. And then you start out a lot of time in the classroom, as well as there's some time in the simulator as well. So there are these big boxes that are on hydraulic controls, so they move around and you're inside of them with this it's probably pretty good at this point, now 25 years later. But when I was in, it was these really blocky representations of what your visuals might be. So we had a little bit of time getting to know the cockpit of the Huey, starting out with the Huey and then the OH-58 in the simulator, if I remember that correctly. There certainly was lots of that in the Apache. And then you get out to the flight line and you get up and fly pretty quickly. And the one thing that I do remember that I think is a great metaphor, but it's also was a very memorable experience, was learning to hover the helicopter, because anyone can fly straight. Anyone can fly straight and level. It's doing other things that are more challenging. And so learning how to hover was, it was like a 10-hour process, and you fly in about an hour a day, and you call it a stick buddy. So we each had somebody that we sat down at a table with to study with an instructor. So one instructor, 2 pilot candidates. The stick buddy would fly an hour and you would fly for an hour. So there were like 10 days and you just never knew that you were actually ever going to be able to hover. You thought, well, gosh, I'm going to be the one person that can't do this. And in the course of that, while you're trying to hover, you're just swinging wildly all over like a football sized area. And then one day you just do it. They call it the hover button, finding the hover button. Because one day after 10 hours of flailing around, facing certain death and certain expulsion, you suddenly find it. And then suddenly you can hover. I just thought that was the most interesting thing.
When you become competent on an airship like that, what does it feel like? How can you describe the feeling of being competent to fly something like that? Because to some degree, it's like you're a bird. You've got this control, you've got this ability to maneuver. What is the euphoria? What's the sense that happens in you? I'm sure it happens every time you fly, or do you reach a point where it just feels so second nature that you don't think about how wonderful it is?
Well, it's interesting because what I just described to you was kind of the early part of flight school. Once you move into the advanced aircraft and you move into the Apache, for example, the Apache is a tandem-seated, it's an aerial weapons platform is what it is. So it's highly stabilized. It's highly computerized. So really, you're a systems manager in that cockpit. Now, when you're just flying, free flying, not in a mission kind of a configuration, but you're just flying, it's just awesome. And I will say a military helicopter, especially, you're flying so low. I mean, sometimes you're in creeks down below the trees, and it was amazing. I mean, it was incredible to be able to do that. You dive down over cliffs. But this is not the kind of flying that you normally do. Normally, what you do is you fly out to a place where, and this is obviously in training, but then in a war, you would do the same sort of a thing where you fly out to a place and you do an overwatch. So you come to a high hover. My backseater would normally be flying. I would be controlling the cameras and potentially the weapon systems. And then it's systems management. You've got 3 different sight systems on the nose that see under day and night and infrared. You have a 30 millimeter high explosive cannon hanging from the belly, and on the wings, there's any combination of a 2.75 inch folding fin aerial rocket and an anti-tank Hellfire missile. And this is all the computers that you're managing in the cockpit. So there's this, we talked about some pretty intense focus earlier, that requires some pretty intense focus, complete and total immersion in what you're doing with absolutely no distractions. And that's pretty cool.
Yeah. Okay. Let's talk about weapons. Yeah. Okay. We talk about how cool it is to fly the helicopter, but now it's really cool to fly the helicopter and start.
Yeah.
Now you are in the movies officially. You are officially in one of Schwarzenegger's or Stallone's films or whatnot. What does it feel like for the first time when you get a chance to press the button, so to speak, on these assorted weapon systems?
They're all very different. There's an incredible amount of planning that goes into it and an incredible amount of focus that's required, as it should be, to deploy any of those systems. I was fortunate that I've only ever deployed them against a target before you ask, like a target range as opposed to a live target. But it's a ton of fun. I mean, the 30 millimeter is loud and shakes the aircraft. The rockets, this is a couple decades ago, so you'll have to, any of your listeners who are more recently familiar will have to forgive me. But anyway, there were places where you set your target on the rockets, you figure out what you need to be able to do, and you pull the nose of the helicopter back to give it the elevation so that you can hit the target with the rockets. And the Hellfire missile, which is by far the most lethal of those systems, and obviously meant for kind of long-range engagement of armor, that's really what it's built for. That is just total focus and concentration. I mean, even your training missiles are $35,000 a pop. You don't want to mess it up. And at the same time, there's nothing significant that happens to the aircraft. It drops off the rail and then it goes forward. You're completely and totally focused on keeping that cursor over the target and making sure that the missile hits. Again, this total focus. But I do think that there's some extra endorphins that are significant in the course of that, for sure, to do a live fire.
Even though I'm looking at your book right now in front of me with your fine photo on the front, the grit factor, but we're talking about grit without talking about it. You know what I mean? I mean, it's like, I'm just taking you through your life. And I think people by osmosis, they're kind of saying, oh, okay, the grit, sometimes it's hard to kind of put a finger on. But if I'm taking you through your story, people are going to be thinking, well, okay, this lady, she's done some stuff that I didn't do, or she's gone down a path that I didn't go, or she's got a perspective. It doesn't necessarily mean you're better, right, or wrong, but it's a different path. It's a different thinking. It's a certain level of grit that we can all learn from.
Thank you. I hope it's inspiring. I think I'm grateful for the opportunities that I've had. I'm grateful for being brought up in a way that made me not afraid to go after those opportunities. I had a chance to connect with all these other leaders who have done these phenomenal things and have these incredible journeys and were willing to share their stories and their lessons learned, because then you don't just have mine, you have the synthesis of all of these stories and all of these people really candidly sharing their experience. And I will say that women leaders often don't share their experience. I think this goes back to our generalizations and our acculturation, but we're sort of brought up to be more modest. And I think that not only women, but men need to hear these stories from these phenomenal leaders that have done incredible things.
Apache attack helicopter, going over time, if you had to say total number of pilots, total number of female pilots, where do you think we are in terms of that?
What's interesting, you would think that would have been the research for the book, and it was part of my attempted research. I even did a request to the military and the government through the Freedom of Information Act. They literally don't have statistics, which is absurd, on the percentage of women pilots or the percentage of women attack pilots. Now, maybe they do for 2020, I have no idea, but they didn't for the 90s. The common knowledge was that there was no more than 2% women in aviation as a whole, which includes flying the lift missions and that sort of thing, which women have been doing for some time, but no more than 2% in that. And in the attack aviation community, it was negligible, like it wouldn't even rate. anywhere as a point percentage. And I don't think that it's significantly greater than that. I mean, you see that even in civilian aviation. There's still a huge dearth of women pilots. And in military aviation, it's much more significant. And then you continue to winnow that down as you get into the ranks of the attack aircraft. There certainly are more than when I went through, but I think it's still a pretty negligible number.
I love how you say this. Grit is a skill. Grit is a skill. You can learn it. Now, me, not having the military experience, a lot of entrepreneurial experience. So I've observed that most people don't want anything to do with being an entrepreneur. There's too much risk out there on the ledge, so to speak. But I'm not going to say I'm pushing back, because I know you've got a really interesting perspective and a tremendous amount of experience. But I wonder sometimes, grit's a skill, but people have to be open and be willing to trust that Shannon's going to take them down a path that they can learn from. Because if they just say no at the very beginning, if they can't even cross the first threshold to follow your training, to get to the point that they can find out that grit is a skill that they could learn, if they're closed-minded at the very beginning, they'll never learn that grit is a skill.
I get asked every single time, like, can you build it? And people ask for themselves, they ask for their colleagues, they ask for their children just as often, probably about equally in each of those different categories. Can you build it? I think people are desperate to know this. And the answer is yes. I mean, the science is clear on this. You do like anything else. Like, you're not going to run a marathon unless you're willing to train for it. You're going to build grit when you're willing to train for it and when you're willing to do what's required to build that resilience and to build that grit.
I think for me, the simple heuristic is, if I know you exist, if I know you, the other women that you've profiled in your work, if I know they exist and I know they have these achievements, then me, myself, I can't make excuses to say it's impossible. I can say I don't want to do it. I can say I'm not interested, but I can't honestly, intellectually, an intellectual, honest argument can't be made that it can't be done because those people did it. And if those people did it, that means anyone can do it. And what I'm saying right now, I think is one of the biggest problems in my home country of America is that we have sort of lost in a way exactly what you're talking about in your work, this grit mindset, because too many people are sitting back saying, well, regardless of their partisan stripe, the next election will solve it for me. The next person will fix it for me. Oh, come on. Pull those boots up and tie the laces and get on with it, right?
Oh my gosh, I could not agree with you more. There is nobody that is going to save anybody. You've got to be in the game and you've got to be playing that game. I mean, life is for living. It's not for expecting it to be lived for you. And I think as a American culture have some work to do to reclaim that. And there's so much opportunity in that. It's an opportunity and a responsibility, and both are just as important.
America started with that. I mean, this cowboy mindset, this entrepreneurial mindset is what built America. In some ways, maybe we are looking at younger generations are just reaping the benefits of so much hard work and so much success. And maybe they just don't have the same, maybe the spring's a little unwound now.
Yeah, it's interesting. I don't know. I feel like maybe every generation says that about the younger generation. So I'm hopeful that it's just an indicator that you and I are of a similar age where you start to look at young people and say, that's not the same as what we were. I think there's a lot that are stepping up too. So I'm hopeful for that. I mean, the reality is most people, like the greatest number of people, there's only going to be a few ever that are willing to really put themselves out there, to really take a risk, to really live fully. There's all the philosophers that have bemoaned this for centuries. Most people just go through the motions, but there's such opportunity and so many ways that you can contribute and give back and serve and make the world a better place. I really do hope that we can continue to share stories and ideas with each other as a culture to encourage that.
Speaking of stories, let me take you down a few little nuggets from some of the women that you spoke to, military women, and some of their process of getting through things. The first one I got to start with, Karen Brash, how she says it?
Isn't she amazing? Oh, we've connected actually in many other ways than just this book now, and I'm just so thrilled to know her.
Okay, well, let's just go big picture with her. People will have to dig into more inside the book, but let's stick with the wall. I love just seeing that nugget about the wall. Set that up, explain it to people, the full context of what I'm talking about. Yeah,
Karen is, so I wish I could give you all the context of how I've gotten to know her now, but she's just fantastic. She was one of the first women to fly in the Navy. She flew helicopters, but she would describe herself before she joined the Navy as just a big-haired Texas sorority girl. And she went and came from a family where she really had to scrape by to make it through college and work full time. Then went and took a flying lesson one day with somebody, and she saw a poster that said "Fly with Bubba." She showed up on the flight line and asked this guy to hold her Diet Coke, and she's there in her mini skirt and her big hair, and he's like, "I'm not holding that Diet Coke, put it down." She didn't come in with some of these other leaders that I've talked to who came in as these incredible college athletes and kind of more what you would expect might lead you into the military. And she signs up for the Navy. She goes to the officer candidate school. It's interesting. I just told her story in an article that just came out today as well. She sees the sign over the entrance that, oh gosh, is it adversity sharpens steel, I think, or something like that. Anyway, she goes in, she's completely and totally feels behind in academics. She feels behind physically. She's not an athlete. And the story that you're referring to, which is just brilliant, is that there's this obstacle course that she's required to get through. And she tells several other aspects of her story as well. And she cannot get over the wall in the obstacle course. She can't. She won't make it if she can't get over that wall. Fortunately, she's not the only woman that can't get over the wall. So she goes back into the barracks at night. And when all of the other women are asleep, she and those other few women who are having a tough time with that wall realize that the concrete wall in the shower is the same height as the wall on the obstacle course. At night, after everyone else is asleep, and you can imagine they don't sleep a lot in OCS, they're running at this concrete wall in the shower to get themselves up and over. And finally, she does it. The instructors are just completely floored. It's a tremendous metaphor for what it takes to do the hard things sometimes.
Is there any branch or any part of U.S. military, any discipline, even if I phrase these things wrong, where women are not allowed? I had a buddy years back, we're still friends, but I met him in San Diego. He was with the Navy and one of the crazier guys. So you can guess what he did. He was a SEAL. Is everything open to women right now in the U.S. military?
As far as I know, everything is open. There is a woman who's made it through the Special Forces, the Green Beret course. There are a number, I think there's like 30 women that have made it through the Ranger course now, which is known, by the way, especially in those first cohorts, to be some of the hardest cohorts when there was originally some backlash, like, oh, they must have changed the standards. And that was very clearly not the case from many of the different statistics that were available at the end. But yeah, there are women that are serving in the infantry. I don't know that there has ever been a female fighter pilot in the Blue Angels. I interviewed the one that flew Fat Albert, which is the C-130, but that doesn't mean that they're not allowed to be, but they haven't yet been. So I believe the doors are technically open all around, but that doesn't mean that the doors are open, if you know what I mean.
I guess there's politics, there's culture, there's, I guess, entrenched leaders might throw obstacles in the way. And then there's, I guess, maybe women in the military have to spend extra time getting around obstacles that men might not have to spend time getting around.
Yeah, I think that's fair. I mean, that's why really I focused this book on, I like to just say I'm focused on leaders, but they happen to be women who happen to be in the vanguard of their military careers. And what that means is that they pretty much 2-1, some of them are willing to admit it more than others, but faced really what I call a double crucible. And they had not only the incredible challenges of what the military would throw at anybody that was there, but they had this double challenge of having to work within an environment where they're constantly working to get past these obstacles. And that really is a double crucible. It's not the same thing that you go through when the culture accepts your being there. When you have to prove yourself every single day, and when you have to go up against often pretty untoward things that are around you that are resistant to you being there, I think that really is another level of grit. It's not your standard garden variety grit.
When I think back to being a guy in high school in the 80s, and I think a lot of these conversations were at least on the edges starting to happen. And I think probably during that time, most people, most men especially, I'm sure myself, you would hear about women pushing the envelope in the military. And most guys would probably much like, oh, come on, stop that, whatever. And I don't think it was because there was a hatred or something like that. I think it was more like everyone had a hard time maybe imagining their mom or their grandmom or something like that, that they would just have a hard time crossing that bridge. Now, 30 years later, I look at it and I say, if somebody, anybody is competent and they want to do it, they have passed everything. I'm the last person that wants to give an opinion to say they can't do it. It's illogical. If somebody's competent, if somebody can do it, if they've met all the requirements, for me to go ahead and say they can't do it or they should not be allowed to do it is intellectually dishonest.
It is. I mean, the other thing that I honestly cannot figure out, well, I can figure it out, but it still doesn't make sense to me, is that if you really truly want the highest performing organization or team or whatever it is, and your bottom line matters to you at all, it's pretty clear that you want to pull from the 100% of the talent pool, not 50% of the talent pool. And you want to enable every one of that 100%. It just seems like it's so obvious. And I have a really hard time figuring out why people can't get past themselves to make that the case. But that is still very much the world today.
I think maybe sometimes too, women understand this on one level, but I think for most men, when you take most men in that range of 18 to 25, there is only one thing we're thinking about. There is only one thing we're thinking about at that point in time. Nothing else. We're really not thinking about our job, our career, military, or anything. Men at that age, actually, it starts at about age 13. Okay. So.
Oh gosh, I have a boy that's 10. Oh no.
You're not thinking about anything. And so I think that I'm sure that's governed decision-making over time. I'm not saying it's correct or not. I'm just sure that it's such a hormonal thing with men. And it really is amazing how much time we waste as men. It's a one-track focus. You only see it when you get a little bit on in time, I guess. I don't know.
Funny thing is, like, as a woman who's just a little bit younger than you are, we're in the same age range. And I can look at my boys growing up and I look at the teenagers around us and I can see all of that now for what it is. But when you're the 21-year-old woman, you don't understand any of that stuff. Or you might have had somebody tell you, which actually I didn't, but you certainly don't get it. And I don't think you do for a while. It just makes things more complicated.
It feels unfair. If I try to put myself in the shoes of a woman, it's like, this is just unfair. This is not right.
I think that's exactly right. Yes. Because you don't get it. And now, I mean, even getting it, I would still say you got to learn to buck up if you're a guy. And that's what I'll tell my boys and hope their father will teach them. But yeah, and for women too, understanding kind of a little bit more the landscape, understanding each other will probably go a little ways. But you're right. There's still this overriding factor.
And I got to say too, I mean, I know it's part of the perspective. It's your perspective and it's what you had to overcome. But as I look at this conversation, as we wind down, I look at you, your career and the things that you've done. And in some ways, I don't like even using the word woman or male, because I just look at it like you're just an achiever and you just did this. In some ways, it feels, at least to me, if I have to say, well, this woman achieved this, you've achieved things that I'm never going to do. And most of my male listeners are never going to do. So in some ways it feels almost like a negative. It feels unfair to give a qualifier. Do you see what I'm saying? It's like, at least that's my perspective.
I've always thought the same thing about saying someone's a woman author or a woman whatever, right? Is saying, why do you have to qualify that? She's an author or she's a congresswoman or whatever. It is an interesting thing because I both think that is true. And at the same time, in the grit factor, and there's some training that goes along with that at thegritinstitute.com, by the way, called Going for Grit. But we're looking at these leaders that have had to overcome twice as much as their male counterparts. And in that way, it's worth calling out. But it's interesting. I have the same reaction many, many times when somebody says, oh, you're a great example of a woman leader. I'm like, how about just a leader?
That's my point. You say it better than me. That's my point.
No, I totally agree with you. I agree. And yet I'm calling them out separately. But there's a reason for that. And I think it's because whether we like it or not, and again, I'm talking to companies in every industry at every level across the country, this is still a challenge. It's still a real challenge, especially in finance and in technology and certainly in some of the more engineering focused companies. It's still an issue. And so we do need to call out and say, hey, why is this still an issue when it should just be leaders? Why are we talking about this in a different way? And there's opportunity there, I think, to have better organizations, better cultures, better opportunities for all of us.
The book, The Grit Factor: Courage, Resilience, and Leadership in the Most Male-Dominated Organization in the World. Very cool stuff. People are going to have to go dig in. I kind of just touched you on things. Once I saw your bio, I was like, I knew I had to kind of dance you around all kinds of issues of your life to kind of see if I could uncover something. And I did find the common bond with the fraternity system, even though I was probably willing to go more out on a limb than you were, keeping your fine State Department diplomacy of unwilling to criticize the fraternity and sorority system for what it is. However, that's just a side tangent from me. I'm sorry. I didn't try to put words in your mouth or anything like that. Shannon, where can we send people to find out more about you? The book is available and all that kind of fun stuff at Amazon, but where can we send people?
Yeah, I'm at shannonpolson.com, and that's Shannon, Polson.com, and also at thegritinstitute.com. And I play around a lot on Twitter and LinkedIn primarily, also a little bit on Facebook and Instagram. Twitter at A Border Life and LinkedIn under my name. So would love to meet any of the listeners there.
It's a pretty badass cover, so people have to go check that out.
Yeah, Harvard did an awesome job. I will say I was reluctant, but I think they called it all right.
Hey, Shannon, thank you for taking some time. I hope I did not make you too uncomfortable with any tangent questions. You seem to roll with the punches pretty good.
I'll talk about anything. Really, really enjoyed this conversation, actually, very much. Thank you.
I see a time when those awake will understand how to make money in up, down, and surprise markets. Whether new trader or experienced, college student or financial advisor, protecting against a crash or just trying to make a lot of money, trend following offers everyone an answer in uncertain times. To get started immediately, send me an email, michael@covel.com. I will send you the right trend following steps to take along with my free video. But if you want to buy and hold, trust the government and trust Wall Street, this is absolutely not for you.